Good evening and most welcome to 1188 of the Heidegger series. And we will now today go into Lucio Diego Rappaport after all this time. It's a critique, and this is how I, by happenstance, came into it. It's a critique of what I mentioned in the former lecture, the toroid model of consciousness, a simulacrum by Meyer, German and Melhik Spitnev. Let's see if I can get up the light on here. It's a bit dark here. Psychologist Piaget identified topology at the early stage of a child's psychical development as the primal mode of elaborate cognition and thought. Heidegger conceived his phenomenology, the construal of the world by the active subject, having its foundation in topology for cognition and recognition, ultimately information. Academic philosopher Stephen Rosen elaborated this further to identify the topology of phenomenology given by the surfaces of self-reference, the Mobius strip and the Klein bottle. The latter a higher order form of self-reference which subverts the Cartesian divide and the classical conception of space and time as container, due to its self-penetration, self-generation, self-containment. This was further developed by Rappaport to produce a novel paradigm and conception of a unity which involves logophysics as a creative agency. Of form and function, the imaginal domain, time operator, material and informational organizations, perception, cognition, anatomy, physiology, and sign processing. It emplaces the subject as enacting a supraduality, which is also the organizing principle of the subject, in all its forms and the physical world as well. To this effect, Rappaport introduced the concept of logophysics and that of ontopoiesis in terms of supraduality, which provide the foundations of the present critique. Rather than merely a world of objects and processes, the subject as an observer or a participant, we live, create and conceive a world of science operating on science as a weaving of meaning and interpretation, the world of semiosis. Morel identified this as related to the person triad started with feeling, which Rappaport extended to the Klein bottle as a higher form of self-reference, which prompts, jointly with a relatedness to authority, a principle of heteroreference interwoven with self-reference. After all, the mirror neuron phenomenology has identified the self as fully interacting and defined in relation with alterity. The two torus embodies nothing of the kind. Mayer et al. Have presented in a recent trilogy, which somewhat resumes several works of them as group and of separate authorship, two of the last year, in which they claim to have presented a model of a grand unified toroidal musical model for which consciousness would emerge. They claim it to have it for the metaform, the dual torus. Due to its claimed association with self-reference, for which then consciousness would be somewhat embodied in this surface. They have also identified this as loosely related to the vortex as the primeval form of nature. In doing so, they took for its fundamental operation the resonance coupling between the brain and singularities of space-time at the Planck level of the vacuum. All of them claim to be somewhat related to the two torus. The latter is repeatedly glossed upon with no argumentation nor association with an ontology, other than the dualism set as by default. In doing so, they have presented a just so chain of references and processes, at times treated therein, and at times attributed to them, which would ultimately be related to the two torus and the vortex. In the work there is no phenomenology at all, no perception, cognition, nor a subject other than an entity from which physical processes would produce the emergence of consciousness. For them, space and time, the processes there eventuated, are given. The cybernetics, though they refrain to mention it as such, they propose for them, though they repeatedly draw figures claiming a circular causality. The only circularity is the repeated attribution of the two torus to be the case in all of them, without a unifying ontology, nor epistemology, nor to support any of them separately, nor their claimed unity, other than the two torus. However, for a start, the two torus does not embody the self-reference they claim to operate, if not a banal form of simple, trivial repetition. So self-reference as ultimately leading to the appearance of consciousness is no more than an attribution to the two torus, rather than embodied by it. Consciousness, as already said, in its most elementary form of feelings and affections, operate through supradual logophysics. The hyperclean bottles and interpenetration of Klein bottles. If music will be the case, which they do not distinguish whether they mean by this the phenomenology of music as experience, created or performed, or the world of sound, the two torus also fails to embody the fundamental one-to-one and two-to-one harmonics as united. A principle of two-ness fused as oneness, or oneness decomposing to two-ness as its manifestation, which instead are embodied by both the non-orientable single-sided Möbius strip and the Klein bottle. So to resume, their whole model is a physicalist reductionism which develops in terms of attributions to what does not embody it, the dual torus. Thus, it is no surprise that there is no ontology for its repeated appearance, nor argumentation for that matter. It is there because it is wanted by authors to be the case, or someone else have claimed it too, with no ontology to sustain it too, but dualism. After all, most scientists and philosophers fail to consider themselves with their subjectivity in their theoretizations and attributions are taken for ontological, not an induction or projection of the subject. So is the case of their proposal of a topological model. In the first place, as a matter of face value, it is merely an icon raised to the sign of being by their attribution, and static, hardly the embodiment of consciousness. After all, quite fluid at that. So that presentation takes the form of a tautology, in which the hypothesis of the two torus is turned to be thesis, to be resurfaced at other point of the presentation as an hypothesis, recurred till the end. Again, the world and all that they consider are given, no phenomenology involved in their making. For a start, they claim it to be founded in a grand musical algorithm, which they purportedly extracted from the studies of hundreds of articles in which natural frequencies are discussed. Remarkably, they do not show how this algorithm is deduced from it. This author has failed to identify it in their other articles, nor they identify the topology which the algorithm would presumably generate, whether refer it to the experience of tonality. So much for a topological ontology, nor they mention what it is bearing to the different processes they refer to, other than characteristic frequencies of them. So it is hard to support in this case an attribution of musicality, if not as sound, nor to the two torus in doing so. Simply, the latter does not embody proportions of no kind. Would an information field had arisen from the statistical inference of the frequencies incorporated in the algorithm, then its traces have been omitted and will only be invoked allegorically as the information field. Allegories suggest, but do not place in their evidence nor explain, and it is perhaps in the retraction of informative value that their attributional operation is most implicit, and then it is to the reader to make up for what is missing, very much as our brains fills the missing information. This is the case of their model. If not taking a metacognitive stance, it is quite difficult to submit it to examination, further going thoroughly into details to find their presentation wanting. Myths operate similarly. Would they mean by this music tonal space then certainly different models embody knots on the two torus which edge Möbius strips and other knots? The former appears in Gauss's tornets, tonal space as well as the Klein bottle and the two torus. These knots and hybrid structures of molecules are crucial to the topological chemistry paradigm and applications to allosteric recognition as topological transformations, all which they refrain from commenting at all. Tonal space takes myriad of forms, mostly depending what are the distance between the musical keys or chords are considered, and thus the Klein bottle or still the Clifford torus appear. Ultimately, they are referred to the circularity of perception of octaves around the tritone, which elicits a Möbius strip topology of the circularity of mental rotations. They appear at the basis of a neurological rotations are related to populations of neuron as nonlinear oscillators, dynamical systems, and as topological models of elementary particles as torsion geometries. The authors, although they indicate the universality of vortices, they refrain to mention their relation to non-orientability, though they comment on knots and their relation to solitons. Their making of a taboo to the point of censorship and self-censorship, misrepresentations and misappropriations of torsion geometry seems perhaps to be the intimate relation with supraduality, which they reject outright, though they propose a continuity between the brain and the vacuum Planck black holes. Torsion geometries are the backbone of quantum mechanics, gravitation and the fundamental interactions, fluid and magnetofluid dynamics. Brownian processes, nonlinear evolutions and chaos, morphogenesis, pattern formation and recognition, and embodied in life as liquid and ordinary crystals. Fluid motions, which is the case of water, actually coherent water domains, which they refrain to indicate their non-orientability in its cellular and genomic operations. Remarkably in this regard, when they discuss the creation of order and coherence as processes of self-organization, as quantum field bosonic condensates, which lay at the creations of torsion geometry of dislocations, liquid crystals, topological structures, etc., which are crucial to the resonance between coherent water domains, genomes, and electromagnetic fields, and the emergence of codes, which are fractal and non-orientable. Remarkably in this regard, when they discuss the creation of order and coherence as processes of self-organization, as quantum field bosonic condensates, which lay at the creations of torsion geometry of dislocations, liquid crystals, topological structures, etc., which are crucial to the resonance between coherent water domains, genomes, and electromagnetic fields, and the emergence of codes, which are fractal and non-orientable, and the basic to life and semiosis as the operation of constraints. They refrain to comment on the non-orientability and torsion geometry of them, and particularly upon interacting. Also remarkably, given the importance of cyclic processes, they refrain to mention that torsion establishes an elementary cycle related to spin and the Planck constant. And this is a protoform of indication and still of semiosis. Also Dolce, though not in terms of geometry, has shown the cyclicity that supports the common basis for both gravitation and quantum theory. The authors refrain on mentioning all of this, though remarkably they do mention the thesis by Hu and Wu of the role of spin in the brain configurations that would support consciousness. To resume the banal formula of the self-reference attributed to the two torus is one for which the cyclicity appears as given. Like a circle, but for an inert hole in the middle, it closes and cannot do anything but that. Torsion manifests inhomogeneity as singularity which ruptures space and thus requires to surmount it, and that is what torsion does. So in doing so, re-establishes an order broken by singularity by integrating it into the whole process of construing a geometry, and as the agency doing so. This is the case either of a subject closing the gap or in the lack of it. Nature does it all. by its own. This filling the gap is self-referential by closing the circuit and at the same time heteroreferential to the singularity. And non-banal self-referentiality, indeed, it already embodies heteroreferentiality. In terms of the non-orientability, it takes the twist of the Möbius strip or the double twist by which the Klein bottle self-penetrates. In doing so, it creates a novel relation which cannot be subsumed as in the formula object in space before subject, which identifies the dualistic ontology that supports it. The object and the subject passively contain in space as if unrelated. Instead, the Klein bottle dynamically creates itself, and in doing so integrates outside and inside, rather than dichotomizing them as in the dual ontology. Torsion embodies a protoform of indication, of semiosis, the vortex of manifestation. The authors cannot have any of the kind. Consciousness is to emerge somehow. Let us examine how they claim the magic work. Perhaps suffices to examine their attribution of a resonant coupling between the brain and the geometry of vacuum's event horizons, which they claim to be as a consequence of the mutual two-torus metaphor. Their attribution would stem from Toft's theory of virtual black holes, in which he clearly stated that what is remarkable about them is the stunning fact that they embody a Möbius strip surface which support time-like close geodesics, which by the way are the case of the Gödel solution of general relativity. Here the attribution of the presumed role of the two torus as an embodiment of consciousness is proved not to be the case, and unfortunately this is repeated by them all the way through in their presentation. Toft's non-ordinary topology for the event horizon appears as the Möbius strip, as an antipodal projective identification, which is crucial also to music perception. The Tritone Paradox already mentioned. The very possibility of pattern recognition and creation embodied as the Klein bottle metaphor, and the mind's modelization of vision for static objects and for a locomoting observer moving linearly, and also for the constitution of selfhood. Another example of misrepresentation of their non-orientability as a Toroid model. They claim one example of a recurrent toroidal type of brain activity might be found in the periodically repeated pattern of the so-called grid cells in the brain. These have therefore been related to supposed toroidal architecture of brainwave attractors. Here the mistake is both by McNaughton et al. And by Mayer et al. The fact that there is a periodicity does not imply per se the torus-like character of it. Actually, McNaughton et al. Draw lines through the center of the periodic grid as already representing the antipole character which the boundary conditions imposes. Not their toroidal topology, but the Möbius one. Seems that Mayer et al. Were aware of the mistake and chose to follow it, yet with their supposed Freudian slip for disclaimer. Whatever the entailment they propose is also a slant of suggestivity, no else. As said before, this is the cognitive pattern which they fully embrace all along the presentation. Say, in the framework of the present model for brain function, both the subjective unconscious and conscious aspect can in principle be modeled as information flow and recurrent storage as taking place in a nested toroidal setting, since the human brain organization clearly shows functional circuitries and obvious fractal properties. The nested toroidal character cannot be inferred from the recurrence they attribute to a presumed top-down or bottom-up organization, if not by suggestion. That the brain anatomy-wise is a nested fractal structure does not exhaust its description, since the neural networking is crucial to its operation and organization, and thus the topological studies of the brain connect on. Yet let us proceed to the Neurosciences and Cybernetics. As already McCulloch noted shortly after his pioneering work with Pitts on neural networks, which established the digital computational modeling of the brain, the presently acknowledged fact is the operation of feed-forward process on the upper brain sectors that connect the primary cortex with the higher ones. He considered them as an embodiment, not of hierarchical connection recurrent first-order cybernetics, but an heterarchy by which the neural architecture abandons the two-plane architecture which was retaken by McCulloch's colleague Gotthard Günther to propose superdual logics. This was also discovered by Spencer Brown and in his Calculus of Indications, and retaken by Varela to formulate his dualistic theory of autopoiesis. By considering this re-entrance in terms of extending the dual logic to include an Ouroboros third state, to immediately drop it down as a mere formalization. Indeed, he hinted that this entailed in considering the Klein bottle as the metaform of self-organization, but quickly dropped it, claiming that Günther's urgence to consider superdual ontology was too difficult to understand. Thus, autopoiesis was laid to remain the dualistic paradigm of closed self-organization vis-à-vis the environment by neglecting the latter no contextualization, no adaptation, no learning, no ecologic as an integration of self and alterity, no Klein bottle at the ontological basis. So is the toroidal model of a closed purported self-organization. By the way, while anticipatory causality is the case of non-orientability, and the toroid cannot hold if not as a banal impredictivity of circular form. Indeed, he hinted at this entailed in considering the Klein bottle as the metaform of self-organization, but quickly dropped it, claiming that Günther's urgence to consider supradual ontology was too difficult to understand. Thus, autopoiesis was laid to remain the dualistic paradigm of closed self-organization vis-à-vis the environment. By neglecting the latter, no contextualization, no adaptation, no learning, no ecologic as an integration of self and alterity, no Klein bottle at the ontological basis. So is the toroidal model of a closed purported self-organization. By the way, while anticipatory causality is the case of non-orientability, the toroid cannot hold if not as a banal impredictivity of circular form. Actually, the self-referential nature of the brain organization, rather than pointing out to a Matryoshka-like nested dual organization, as Mayer et al. Claim, point out to a Klein bottle circular cybernetics, and still hyper Klein bottle higher order, due to the modularity with plasticity nature. So is the toroidal model of a closed, purported self-organization. By the way, while anticipatory causality is the case of non-orientability, the toroid cannot hold if not as a banal impredictivity of circular form. Actually, the self-referential nature of the brain organization, rather than pointing out to a Matryoshka-like nested dual organization, as Mayer et al. Claim, point out to a Klein bottle circular cybernetics, and still hyper Klein bottle higher order, due to the modularity with plasticity nature of the brain physiology, architecture, not to mention the body-mind. Frequencies play wonders and monsters into this. As Persinger proved, it takes a small magnetic field applied to specific parts of the brain to induce altered states of mind, even the experience of God or the state of all as oneness. So no hierarchies in this, heterarchies rather, superduality all the way through. So Mayer et al. Mentioned the brain connectome and its harmonics, and its higher order dimension and singularities. Now they refrain mentioning the Klein-Bottle topology of the primary visual and somatosensory system. And they also refrain to mention that the harmonics that were discovered to be the case of the brain's fundamental functionality in the creation of patterns require a principle for both pattern formation and recognition. This Klein-Bottle unification of the objectual relation with the environment as recognition and the creation of patterns by the body/mind, which thus fuses the making of the world with the perception of it, is a manifestation of an ontology which integrates outside and inside dynamically. Nothing of this kind is embodied by the two torus. To resume the metaform for both pattern creation and recognition, without which there is no perception at all, no action as a unity of action and perception, is the Klein-Bottle, all of which two of the authors had been informed about this author repeatedly. And the higher dimension that have been elicited in brain connectome are already the case of the Klein-Bottle itself, which due to the antipodal decomposition of signals requires for building a unique percept out of a signal to be removed by representing the Klein-Bottle by a standing wave in dimension 5, which unravels the 2-to-1 reading of the signals, not without leaving a paradoxical trace of the making. Remarkably, the authors also refrain on commenting that the Klein-Bottle is the invariant structure of the phase of the receptive fields and their Gabor wavelet representation, which is recognized as the appropriate analytical form of them, known to be the basis of holography, as Gabor himself developed. So where would that claim of holography come from? In that trilogy, from the toroidal form of the black hole event horizon, which Toft stated is non-orientable, would hold the holographic information, so a no-go in their settings. If form and function are manifestations of an underlying principle, which they take for duality, then the case either is the torus 2 or the Möbius strip due to the singularity being looped around. Toft showed that the latter to be the case. The mistake and misrepresentations are not restricted to neuroscience and physics of black holes, For instance, they claim that the 720-degree symmetry of fermions is embodied by the two torus. They cannot be more mistaken. There is no 720 symmetry on the two torus, while it is the very architecture of the Möbius strip and Klein bottle. The two complete turns along a longitudinal path to return to the identity. Thus, the 2-to-1 and 1-and-1 harmonics of them, as embodied, as already said, rather than their attribution of harmonics to the two torus. At this point, this author cannot refrain of commenting whether the authors are aware of the making of a case or what is not, and erasing all information that actually make evident their construction untenable or are simply inertial to their dualistic undertaking. And the latter is an unconscious obliteration of what they reject. The latter, after all, has been the hegemonic cognitive pattern after Plato's rejection of the inherent superduality of the conception of Parmenides, the founder of Greek philosophy and science. It was subsequently adopted as the mainstay conception of the Western world, though with a brief respite thanks to Bishop Cusanus with his coincidentia oppositorum principle, with which Jung identified the psyche, Hegel's dialectics, and the hidden practice of alchemy, say by the founders of Royal Society, Isaac Newton, for one, yet which was not incorporated in the science. The Orient did not fall to it as the doctrine of the Tao, Nagarjuna's middle way, or still Zen Buddhism did their own. Thus, the simulacrum that this author has felt, most unfortunately, obliged to qualify their work with, appears as very much appropriate. That dualism is the case is also placed in evidence with their comment. It follows that also galaxies, suns, planets, and likely the entire universe, and even life systems are also to be regarded as toroidal organized information fields, each projecting digital information on their respective event horizons. According to the classical information theory, information always arises through interactions of wave particles, and entropy of information represents the potential to ask yes and no question in such an event with regard to particle system. According to these concepts, information is in fact the sum of expected information obtained from such yes and no questions. Several comments are in order. First, that information fields would project digital information is an attribution of digitality which does not correspond to information fields in any of the meanings that science contemplates, other than Shannon's classical information theory. One can only wonder how could the latter be invoked to be the case. In a world of quantum physics and consciousness, where superduality is the case for both, the digitally rather than a priori is derived from supraduality, as coexistent with an information associated to continuity, cooperating with singularities. Remarkably, the authors have been unable to realize that quantum entanglement is a manifestation of superduality. That duality is not the case as argued in Jaeger 2008, which clearly states the inapplicability of classical dual logic and classical information theory to quantum mechanics. Would they still insist on bringing classical information as associated to a conscious subject? Shannon's conception fails completely due to the lack of contextuality and inhomogeneity. Thus, it bears a complete disregard for meaning and interpretation, ultimately semiosis, which, as we said, is all about supraduality. Semiosis is raised in the author's dualistic physicalist reductionism. They can only bring it back by attribution. Furthermore, morphogenesis cannot be ascribed to Shannon's information, since due to its lack of inhomogeneity, it cannot stand for a morphogeneric field. So their whole ascription of information fields to a two-torus topological theory is another major incoherence of their theory. More of this below. They mistakenly conflated digital with dual ontology, promoted to information ontology. Wheeler's it from bit. Not only there is no place for consciousness, neither there is for morphogenesis in their theory. However, digitality is proper to the Klein bottle, jointly with continuity. Remarkably, the authors mentioned Kozyrev's work on information fields, supporting circular causation at an astronomical level. They refrained to inform the reader that he had identified them as a torsion field, though of a kind unknown. Simon Schnoll also identified informational fields as supporting the palindromic shapes of the histograms of random experiments. According to the temporal cycles of the Earth palindromes, are natural embodiments of Möbius strips or two tori as well, but as in the case of geophysical morphology of the surface of the Earth, in terms of the same cycles that Scholl considered, the former is the case, not the torus. Again, the coincidentia oppositorum displayed in geophysical configuration shows this to be the case. the authors chose to neglect this. So let us try to identify their information fields afresh, as if torsion and non-orientability would not be the case. To start with, quantum information theory, which the authors do not mention. The fundamental operator in this theory is the Hadamard gate, the matrix representation of the Klein bottle, which though has a digital coding embodied, it is as the four-state character of it: outside, outside, inside, inside, and the in-betweenness, inside, outside, and outside, inside, so that it embodies both continuous and logical information with digital 1, which is the key to the genome. Consider next the possibility of information theory as an upspring of Bayesian inferential statistics for another paradigm, which they ignore. There, the yes-no epistemology is acknowledged to be a possible simplification of a supra-dual ontology, but associated to continuous probabilities, so indeed it is an epistemology. So again, it is digitally superposed with analogics, but quantum cognition rectifies this, as we discuss below. Remarkably, as quantum effects are supposed to be the case at the black hole event horizon, it is remarkable that much of theoretical physics is deducible from this. The so-called Fisher information geometry, even quantum mechanics, particularly the Fisher metric of statistics, which provides the measure of proximity of the informational fields of inference. The logarithmic gradients of the probability distributions is transformed into the Fubini study metric of the projective pre-Hilbert structure of this theory. The decision in terms of yes/no decision, which Mayer et al. Claim to operate in the relation between the brain and the event horizons, in terms of the Schrödinger equation for open and also closed systems in configuration space, is a torsion gradient field which produces the evolution of a system to a particular case, the so-called collapse of the quantum state. To put it in other terms, the informational fields of statistical inference transform to the quantum field as the gradient torsion field on the Hilbert projective space. To put it in other terms, the informational fields of statistical inference transform to the quantum field as the gradient torsion field on the Hilbert projective space. But then, where the non-orientability of, say, the Möbius strip appears in the projective Hilbert space. Indeed, the temporal evolution of a quantum state traces a curve in this space, and due to the antipodal identification of the projectivity, a shift of the phase by 180 degrees again. This evolution generates a Möbius strip. No go. We give it a final try. We examine the decision process itself. Quantum cognition has stemmed from recognizing that belief and decision processes follow the rules for quantum mechanics upon introducing contextuality to probabilities. The so-called Växjö interpretation of quantum mechanics. It can be framed in terms of Clifford algebras, where the idempotent E3 holds the superposition state as a logical operator. It happens that it is isomorphic to the torsion of cognitive space. Behold by the two local orientations of the Klein bottle, so that the decision process is tantamount to its unraveling to orientability. This is the information they mention as ascribed to holography on the event horizon, which mistakenly they claimed a two torus. Secondly, however, the brain does not function in terms of dual expectations. If the brain carries out inference at all, it is in terms of pattern, which are so elusive and labile that their existence at all boils down to pattern recognition. Callis 2019, which, as we said, stems from the Klein bottle metaphor, the Markov blanket hypothesis, which would mediate the brain inferential activity, with its four-state architecture in terms of the superposition of two categories, action and perception for one and accessible and inaccessible states for the other, can be naturally embodied by the four-state Klein bottle. So again, we run into confrontation with Myers et al. Information fields and the dual logic, the former unidentified by them. Thirdly, as already said, holograph for the brain is also ultimately rests on the coherent patterns of populations of neurons, whose receptive fields can be represented by Gabor wavelets, and thus their Klein bottle symmetry, which supports holography. Already the coherent neural patterns elicited by motor action synchronize to produce both circular patterns, that is the projection of the two torus, and the Lemminskal 1D projection on the plane infinity of the Möbius strip and Klein bottle. the latter the gait patterns of animal locomotion on solid ground, swimming in fluids, or aerial flights, and the topology of the mammal heart. The authors do acknowledge the vortical patterns of the attractors of the neural. An attractor can also refer to a collection of states that will eventually attract neighboring states toward that collection. In such a manner, self-awareness may be created through folding along the vertex like fields. However, they ignore all the previously stated and still choose only the simplest circular projection that is associated to banal self-referentiality, as already argued. Polyrhythmicity does elicit attractors with the two torus as the underlying phase space manifold, but the actual pattern that is elicited are the knots supported by Möbius strips, as mentioned before, not the whole phase space, which is quite different. After all, attractors do not fill state space, they confuse them. We return to their attribution of the toroid as the singular and further nested universal metaform of morphogenesis and causal organization. Toroids inside toroids as a Matryoshka doll. Would that be the case, then the Möbius strip standing at the center of Milky Way seems to disprove their claim, mysteriously though. So is disproved this allegation about considering that the universe is predominantly made of plasma structures and viscous fluids that do not mention the former, and yet what they visibly elicit, and the authors say nil about, is that knotted and non-orientable configurations already appear in the Sun with its plasma outburst, or still the appearance of the analemma as a binary star configuration, or still as a predominant geophysical structure on the surface of the Earth, arising from the tidal interactions of the crust and the rest of the solar system. The analemma pattern produced by the torsion rotation of the Earth axis in the annual circumsolar rotation is the lemniscale projection of the Klein bottle. The authors appear to be rebuked by the n-body planetary choreographies, which elicit the same pattern, not to mention the knotted patterns of the choreography of the Sun, and the major planets also arising from the projections of knotted dynamics of coupled, non-linear oscillators on the two torus manifold for the phase space. To refute that claim, consider viscous turbulent fluids obey the Navier-Stokes equations, the paradigmatic scale-independent torsion in formation field, from cosmology to body flows, disprove Mayer's contention of a fractal nested toroids as the universal case. Instead, fractal hierarchical nested helicity cascade twisted domains with no definable orientability, the exterior one twisting the interior ones, rather than toroids in which the higher order just contains the smaller one. Back to music. Merrick's psychophysical theory of music and resonance as a universal principle makes the case of dampening cooperating with harmonic resonance. The authors retake this refraining to comment that Merrick departs from recognizing the Möbius strip circularity of tonal space and construes their whole theory in terms of the fivefold pentagonal symmetry, i.e. torsion, and the golden mean, nor that it is psychophysics. They are quite specific in only mentioning what does not question their model altogether as a predetermined chosen rule, it appears, for its embodiments as genomes and the supradual digital biological codes. Space limitations oblige us to defer to a more elaborate presentation, yet final comments are in order. The Kleinbottle Logophysics supports the notion that resonance is a fundamental supradual relationship in the unified making of the universe and subjectivity. What we do reject is 1. The claim that it is supported by a dualistic logophysics, which the authors have forward with a two torus modelization, and 2. Their manipulations of the relevant information, the distortions, omissions, and the kind. Knowing and making science is a social practice of learning and adaptation, a stance that the authors clearly do not share, not my world. So the accusation or the critique coming from Diego Rapoport is that the authors Meyers et al. Are inducing dualism unbeknownst into their system. They have it as a stance, and instead of sort of diffusing dualism, it is enforced, and that by not understanding the mechanisms of the dual Kleinbottle. The Kleinbottle is not sufficiently understood, and therefore the toroid is reinforced, and inside the toroid still a dualistic system is at work, whereas the Kleinbottle diffuses dualism. It doesn't criticize it, it doesn't obliterates it, it doesn't nullify it, it contains it or expands it. I would say both at the same time. It's a containment of dualism, but it is also at the very same time an expansion of it. It is being expanded from within. It's more space. It is not as thin, compressed, tensed. It is opened up. So the actual condensates, the compression, the hyperpressure. Think about small molecules within a closed box, metal box, and it's heated up, and all of a sudden the molecules are popping harder and harder. The calming down of the system makes for more space. Why is that? Well, the less the molecules are moving within this closed box, the more space there is to traverse. So within the confinements of the space, more space can be gained. The idea is space can only be gained by moving of the frontiers is not correct. This is not the workings of space. It can be clearly shown and proven. I think the best one is that it can be shown that space itself can expand and that the frontiers do not need to be moved. We can use the frontiers. And that goes for time as well. We mentioned that earlier on, that limitation of time that death makes is actually, in some cases, an advantage. If the advantage is by limitation, we know what it is. It gets properties, it gets definitions, it gets to be something. But without limitation, the idea of an infinity of Hilbert or Gödel, then you have nothing. It's an explosion of everything. And that obliterates both existence and non-existence at the same go. It's getting late here. I bid you a very good night and I say thank you very much. Have a very pleasant and calmful night. Bye bye for now.